Yeah, I just
Is
think
it?
change management is like the hardest thing with this stuff. I mean, at least, I mean, I think it varies, by the way, and obviously what kinds of systems you're talking about here, right, in terms of technology. But the Gen AI stuff, which is at least where I'm spending my time on technology, it's like, I mean, it's probably 20% of difficulty is actually creating the tool that does what you need, and 80% is just getting people to use the tool, even if it will save them time.
Start sort of high level with some of the challenges implementing horizontal solutions or generic technology solutions. The needs of private market firms are nuanced and complex. And I'm just curious, in your experience as you implement, generic horizontal out of the box solutions, what sort of challenges arise? Maybe Richard, let's start with you.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so, lately the questions I've been getting from a lot of funds are how do I think about using Gen AI to improve my processes, right? So that's sort of the starting question in a lot of cases. And the reality is, first of all, there isn't a lot of off the shelf tooling that's sort of custom made for private investor investment processes. There just isn't very much in the way of a vertical solution that really delivers exactly what you want. So in a lot of cases, you're sort of stuck using horizontal solutions, kind of whether you like it or not, for many applications. But there are a lot of challenges with that I've seen. I mean, I think the most common use case that I see across funds, for example, is knowledge management. So a lot of funds are investing in new knowledge management solutions, right? That can allow them to take their data and activate it and do stuff with it. Um, that can include things like ChatGPT for enterprise, which a lot of funds are using, but it can also include more specialized tools like Blue Flame or Sana or Rogo or all these different tools. And the reality is that some of them, are purpose built for private markets and do have a few kind of off the shelf templates that kind of work out of the box. But even without that, you're still going to have to build a ton of templates yourself to get any value from these tools, right? And so, you're going to have, it might be that there's a generic tool in there for it. I give it a management presentation or a sim and it'll analyze it. But the reality is, if you're a fund, you have your own proprietary way of looking at any potential asset, and you're going to have to build a version that looks at your asset. For Andy, the CVC way of looking at a new company and deciding if it's for us, right? And so, at least as the tools exist today, that's the nature of it. And frankly, that customization is, not that hard to do because you can sort of program in English, right? But not that easy either because there's not a lot of helper tools that really show you how to do it. So it's a tough, that's sort of the where things are, is that's kind of what funds have to do. But I don't think it's easy, and I think as a result, a lot of funds haven't made that much progress, frankly, in really bringing Gen AI into some of their workflows because the tasks I just described are hard to do.
Andy, I'm curious from your perspective, sort of looking across CVC, there are a lot of different groups, presumably, that you have to worry about their technology solutions. I wonder, in your experience, how implementing horizontal solutions works as you're sort of mapping them across an organization with different needs. Any challenges that arise there?
Yeah, for sure. And I'll try and avoid repeating what Richard's already said, and I might stay outside of the Gen AI world since he's such an expert in that area. But yeah, these horizontal solutions often promise enormous capabilities in terms of efficiency and off-the-shelf implementation. But you're right, private markets have a lot of distinct or possibly unique and complex requirements. And so, we spend a lot of time, obviously, in system selection, finding the products that align most closely with our requirements. But often, in what's still a maturing industry, we don't find anything that matches 100%. And every manager has its own nuances as well. So we do find ourselves in a position where we have to customize considerably. So they may solve the immediate problem, but it often creates or it can create substantial technical debt down the road, which in the end can constrain our business and hold us back from growing. So we have to watch as we add new product. We have to be conscious as we grow, add new products, move into new geographies, etc., that we can continue to respond and so on. So when it comes to customization and mapping onto our business, we have to think very carefully about how that customization is implemented. We do it in a very deliberate way, and in a way that can provide flexibility and doesn't lock us in too much to a particular workflow or even a particular vendor.
And is that generally your firm that bears the burden of the customization and the implementation, or is that generally in partnership with the vendor? What does that look like?
Yeah, so we work in partnership with vendors or their implementation partners, but we have to know our own business, and so I'd say the majority of the burden does fall on us. Vendors come in not understanding our business or our industry even. It's down to us to map out our business and invest the majority of the time in the IP.
Richard, I'm curious. Yeah.
Oh, I was
please.
going to actually just build on that. Sorry, and then I'm sure you have another question, but I wanted to just build on that. Because in Gen AI, the technical debt thing is like such a real problem that we've been struggling with. Because what happens is, it's like everything you were saying, Andy, but like times 10, right? Because it's like you build, because even if you build on top of another application, once the underlying models change, you may need to change your template or change your prompting or change how you do things just because they've moved from ChatGPT 4.0 to 5 or from Claude to ChatGPT or whatever, right? And there are nuances to the models that change things. And so it's hard to do any of that without technical debt. In fact, we've actually at Bain been building a platform that's actually a technical layer that sits between the software and the models so that we can have software that just calls this platform and then it will call the models. And that way, when models change, hopefully this tool will be able to keep up and we won't have to keep rewriting our code for talking to the models every time. I don't know if this will, this is what we're trying to do. I don't know whether I think we just got it launched this month. So I don't know whether we'll find out when the next model comes out, whether we did it, but like it's a real problem in this space. There's even a very highly verticalized vendor, I suppose, could protect you from it because they're building the templates, and so they could build their own templates for you. But as soon as you're doing that, you're exposed to that risk. So yeah, totally get it.
Yeah, Richard, I was going to ask, in your capacity advising firms around Gen AI, how much does this sort of prompt management configuration of the tooling, in my experience, when you're using very general horizontal tools, whether it's ChatGPT and the like, or even vendors that have a wrapper around the models, it sort of puts a lot of the onus onto the user to get the prompts right, to ask the questions right, to bring the correct data to bear, all these types of things. I'm curious, how much of a difficulty does that present in your experience?
Well, I think it's a huge problem for a lot of funds, right? Because and funds have chosen a few different ways to solve that problem, but it is a real problem because if as you said, Eric, right? Like what kind of prompt you write actually has a big impact on how good the answer is. So if people aren't writing good prompts or using the best prompts and they get subpar answers, either they're then going to say this tool stinks, I don't want to use it anymore, or they're just at least not getting as good an answer as they could be getting, right? Which is bad in its own way, right? And so I'd say funds are kind of taking like 2 or 3 different approaches, right? So approach number 1 is we're going to just train everybody, right? We're going to get everyone in the fund, have them sit through training, and probably multiple trainings until we give them enough skills to be able to, we think, write good prompts or things like that, right? There's another approach, and again, you can do all of these things, right? There's another approach, which is we're going to create a library of prompts that someone at the center has said this is good, right? This is best practice, and encourage people to use that library, and that could be like a custom GPT, right? So in ChatGPT, I can write a prompt and I can sort of share it with other people and they can have it. Or it could be like a Word document or a SharePoint or something like that, right? Depending on the platform. And that's another approach, right? And then there's like a third approach, which is kind of in the middle, which is you kind of let the ground troops, the frontline people just like build their own templates and then share them with each other as opposed to them being built in the center. and there are pros and cons to all these approaches, which I can get into if you really want to get deeper into this. But those are the kinds of things people are dealing with, and it's tough because you have not everybody wants to learn how to write a good prompt, right? So you have to figure out how to, but you still, but the management of the fund wants everybody to be getting more productive, right? So how do you solve that? It's hard.
Andy, I'd be curious. Oh, go ahead,
So,
please.
Richard, I was just wondering, do you think as these models are evolving, do you think the sort of scale, the impact of the changes will eventually start to reduce? Or will the model providers maybe start to think about that change management concern? I mean, it's interesting, right? Because we want them to improve all the time. So are we going to continue to see what's effectively breaking changes coming through?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, I do think, now we're getting into probably much more conjecture here than actual fact, but your question's a good one, Andy. I mean, I do think that, there's an important question, right, which is what is the curve look like for the models of the future, right? Like, are the models a year from now going to be a lot better than the models today, or are we going to start to see enter an era of more incremental improvement until there's some sort of breakthrough that happens on, a timeline we can't really predict? I think it's still a little unclear, frankly. Like, I think some people look at ChatGPT 5 and they say that the curve is sloping. I look at the data and say, well, they did use some data for bootstrapping, and so that suggests maybe it could go the other way. So I think it's like a little unclear, frankly. Like, there's a range of outcomes, right? If the models just keep getting a lot better, that's where the model companies are going to spend their time. It's just like making us better models, and we just all have to live with it and deal with it and update our software all the time. I think if they start to see that plateauing, then what are they going to do with all these smart engineers they have sitting around, right? They're going to have to start inventing workflow solutions that just make it easier for people to use the tools, right? And so that's where I think you might start to see tools that make it easier for the change management, right? Whether that's, ChatGPT decides to build a package of out of the box templates that are custom GPTs and they already have some off the shelf, but more verticalized packages that they try to make it easier for enterprise customers to use. Or they're starting to experiment already with some knowledge management stuff, which is like sort of a version of built-in RAG. Like, does that get better and like work more out of the box and be more right? So I could see, Andy, that they go on a mission where they say, like, we're going to make it as easy as possible for people to use this, and that's going to be either a differentiator for our model specifically, or a way for us to move upstream, and justify our gigantic valuations or old data centers we're building or whatever, right? So there's lots of paths here. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I mean, for me, this kind of topic, we often talk about buy versus build in these kind of discussions, but in my head, I've always figured there's an element of technology strategy that can't be outsourced, that can't be bought in. And these kind of integration and managing technical debt and so on are the areas that really do in the end fall on the manager to handle, and us in their technology departments. And that, I think, is where a lot of the digital alpha can be sourced, if I could use that phrase, right? Where managing these kind of issues, how you customize, whether you customize which products you choose, how you isolate yourself from change in the future, and so on, I think is the critical part of my role, my responsibility, and my peers. And I think it's something that if you do well, you can deliver huge potential to the firm to allow it to change and flourish. And if it's done badly, you can constrain the firm massively.
I think the digital alpha concept is a super interesting idea, by the way, Andy, because I think there's a mix of perspectives, honestly, among funds, right? So I think there are some funds, especially very large ones like CVC, that do see technology as a potential differentiator for them and an advantage. And I think there's another group of funds that I would say want to be, I don't know, this sounds very pejorative, but like digital beta. I guess they're more interested in digital beta, right? So they want to be fast followers and see what are other people doing and what technologies are working for them, and then they want to adopt those, but they don't want to be building stuff. They don't want to be on the experimenting and leaning on the edge. And I think that's fine. I think that's fine. I think that for many funds, that is probably the right strategy. But for some, they will find ways to find the alpha and lead with it. So yeah, it's an interesting point.
Yeah, I could see that, right? Like it's not, it doesn't always make sense to be on the bleeding edge for sure. But what you can pick up as a beta participant is you can see those bigger decisions. This product is breaking through, is successful. So and so's done a good job. You can pick up, you can pick up the same system that another manager's using, do a better job or a worse job, and have a completely different. I think my personal opinion is you still need to think very carefully internally about your strategy and how you implement and how you, in particular, integrate and manage data.
Both of you mentioned access to data and connectivity as we were talking about, some of the challenges implementing horizontal tools and configuring them. Obviously, in the age of Gen AI or with AI powered tools, access to data, integration of data, things like this become an even larger concern. I wanted to shift the topic of conversation a little bit away from general horizontal tools, more towards the challenge of point solutions. As I talk to CTOs and CIOs at private market firms, there are so many different point solutions embedded in the organization, and these present data silos and present challenges with connectivity, and especially with AI, getting access to that data is very critical. So I'm curious, maybe Andy, let's come back to you. What are some of the challenges in your seat that you see with all the different point solutions across the organization?
I think you've listed some of them already. The data silo is a key one, and I find these point solutions that are often very departmental focused can drive people into very deep silos in the different departments, when what we really need now more and more is a holistic view of the firm. So the challenge is, as it always has been, to create the single source of truth for the organization. So finding these overlapping data sets, mapping themselves, understanding how we can kind of pick up on data quality issues and implement governance and so on. And it's I think the number one challenge for all of us, and what AI has done is bring unstructured data into the picture as well, and mapping all of that across the organization and into our reference data sets.
I think I fully agree, Andy, and I think there's two things I'd add on that. One is just often by their nature, a horizontal solution makes it easier to customize, right? Because they know with the solution that like this isn't going to be perfect for anybody, so you're going to have to build a customized, so they better make it easy. I think with vertical solutions, that's not always the case, right? Where they're kind of assuming that their out of the box functionality is gonna do the job, but for many funds, it may be 80-90% of the way there, but it's not 100%. And getting that extra 100% may be hard to do because it just may not enable the same kinds of customization that a horizontal platform that frankly starts at 40% might make it more possible to get to 100. So I think if you have very unique needs, it can actually be harder to get there with a vertical solution than investing in vertical can be a little harder than horizontal, depending on what your technical capabilities are. But the other point I wanted to make, Andy, which I think you got at with the Gen AI stuff is, one of the things I think where you're going with that question, Eric, a bit is like there's a challenge of like if you've got all these point solutions, it's really confusing for a lot of people at the fund because there's just like all these different things, and you have to remember I got to go here for this and here for that, and that's kind of annoying. And especially if it's something you don't access that often, you don't remember where it is and that sort of thing. I think in the future, my belief is where Andy is going, right, which is that like there's going to be some sort of agent that sits across on top of all these systems, right, and that talks to these point solutions. And so the analyst or associate or partner, whoever, is just going to have a thing on their desktop. They're just going to ask a question, and then that that will just then figure out which point solution to go talk to, and it'll talk to them and come back and give you the answer. And so I actually think in that future world, which does not exist yet, right? And nobody has built that super agent, and like who knows when it'll happen. But in that future super agent world, actually, like that gives the point solutions a bit of an advantage, right? It sort of negates that disadvantage because now I can have 20 points. There's an issue in which that sort of starts to go away because there's a super agent that allows that orchestration among point solutions.
Yeah, that's very exciting for me, Richard. I've implemented certain kind of approach in the past, almost like an application fabric. So with all these point solutions, you have this application fabric that represents your view of the world as a manager. And underneath the orchestration with the point solutions and the management of the data and the integration is managed through that fabric. And it gives you a single pane of glass onto what can be a very complex systems environment. The agentic approach is, as I say, very exciting for me, taking that to a completely different level. But the one thing, and I am seeing it more and more, that this does raise for me though through historic pain, and I still think we're not there. I would like to see more systems built as API first. People still want to own the desktop. They still want their little space on the screen there. I want to see people building their systems from services themselves. It's the little APIs maybe that you don't quite appreciate that make all the difference in these kind of implementations. So that's another factor. It's better than it has been, especially with new entrants. But I can't emphasize how much that would help us out as managers, especially when it comes to the point solutions, right? You're not trying to own the whole space. Just accept you're part of the solution.
I agree. Andy, it's funny. I diligence a lot of software companies, and there are very, very few that are like proud middleware, right? Where they're like, we're middleware. That's what we are. Like, we connect this group to this group, and we do a useful job, and like that's why you should, why we make a lot of money, right? You never, even if that's essentially the case, you never hear that pitch, right? It's always, oh, we have this great thing, and we own the customer. And I agree. Nobody's willing to be just really good middleware, even though I think with agents, more people are going to have to be, right? Because I think that owning the direct connection to the customer is going to get harder, and you're just going to have to accept that being really good middleware is still a great way to make money as a software business, and deal with it.
Yeah, I think what's interesting when you think about agents, it sort of compounds the problem a bit in my mind, though. Like a company that doesn't know its interfaces and doesn't have reasonable APIs that provide access to the system today, I think in the world of agents, you're just going to compound that problem. Like an agent, whether you're using MCP or traditional APIs, an agent needs access to that system to get the data to, exert control. So I think, at least to me, the value of companies understanding APIs and having clean interfaces is also important in the agent era. You can't sort of dismiss that. And I'm curious, Andy, you mentioned interconnectivity and APIs. Are there things that you look at specifically when you're evaluating a solution? Like what types of APIs are useful? Are there particular things that you care a lot about?
Yeah, I guess, we have our standard set of non-functional requirements that we would go through. And, but in general, I'd say the approach is very much one of discovery rather than setting standards. We look like for event-driven, right, is the key. We don't want to be constrained to kind of pull paradigms. But yeah, by and large, we look to, I guess, be flexible around what's available, because that's not going to be the primary driver, especially when you're looking at these kind of point solutions, right? You're looking at niche players. There may be 2, 3, maybe even just one player in that niche. You're a taker of what they have, but ideally event-driven, data-heavy, and something that can be separated out from the UI, right? Nobody wants to be middleware. I've had some very difficult conversations with founders in the past, right? We can do that too kind of conversations. It's like, well, Yeah, sure. But, we're looking for you for this piece of the picture. And the more you open up and allow us to use what we need to use, the better. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm curious on the data consistency piece. So maybe in some not too distant future, the agents take care of this for us. But today, how do you keep the data in sync from all these point solutions? Like, what does that actually look like, Richard? Maybe from what you've seen working with various funds and firms, does this look like pulling it all back into a data warehouse and sort of transforming things for standardization, or what does it look like?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I've talked to that many funds that I would say have like really solved this, have like perfectly solved this problem. I think it really involves a lot of pain for a lot of funds, frankly. I think, yeah, I think you can pull, I think the older sort of model would be create a data warehouse, a data lake, have things flow in there and flow out. I think a newer model is more, a data fabric. So you have individual data sets, but you have an overarching thing that can connect to them and create the illusion of a data lake. I think funds that are on a more modern stack are kind of moving to that. I think beyond that, I mean, I think in the future, and then there's a bunch of people crossing their fingers and hoping agents will help solve this, right, as well. And hoping maybe that'll be the thing that makes it easy. But yeah, I do think you have, I think for reporting stuff, right, like things where you kind of have to do it, they've got it solved, right? They've got some sort of back end system. And I think for the newer applications, right, of, deal data and things like that, the data is all over the place. Sometimes it's a central repository, sometimes it's all over the place, but it's not well indexed, it's not well digested, and it certainly doesn't talk to, and it's not ready to talk to AI in a useful way yet. Or they're very early days.
Mm.
It's great. Okay, so last topic that I would like to cover with both of you is around change management and working with teams implementing technology. We were talking a lot about customization and implementation and training and things like that. And I'm just curious, maybe Andy, let's start with you about general approaches as you're implementing new solutions at the firm.
Yeah, I would say we're very much on the maturing path along here. So the recent history of CVC is probably primarily departmental driven change. And so departments have done a great job of managing their own requirements, implementing their own systems, and so on. What we're looking to now is more of an enterprise view. And, we're going through some cultural shifts there. I mentioned the kind of non-functional requirements and suddenly technology coming in and saying, okay, well, we know you want this system, but these factors are important. And the business is starting to see the value in that. So, that's going very well. But where we still see difficulties around investment teams that are highly diversified and have built up their own ways of working, and that can be very difficult to bring solutions to that group of people that work across the board and where everybody buys into the same sort of solution. So yeah, we're evolving as we speak, but we have now a centralized PMO team that manages the book of work. We have standardized project approval process and business case structure, and also project reporting. So yeah, we're evolving as we speak.
Yeah, I just think change management is like the hardest thing with this stuff. At least, I think it varies, by the way, and obviously what kinds of systems you're talking about here, right, in terms of technology. But the Gen AI stuff, which is at least where I'm spending my time on technology, it's like, it's probably 20% of difficulty is actually creating the tool that does what need, and 80% is just getting people to use the tool, even if it will save them time. Because, and I think this is not unique to private equity, but it's also exacerbated by private equity, right? Which is people are super busy, right? Everyone in a fund is busy all the time. They're going at 100% every day. They're sometimes working weekends, right? They're working super hard. And so when you say I've got a different way of doing this that's better, you know, it's super risky for someone to try it. I mean, even if you're right and it's better and it saves them time, if you're wrong and you try it and it doesn't work, how are you ever going to get your work done? You're already working at 100% of your available hours are already spent on work. So there's no room for error. So it can be really hard to get people to try new things, and even if those things work, right? And then it can be that much harder if the tools maybe don't work that well, right? Maybe they're still in beta and you're piloting them and you're trying to get feedback to make them better. That's even less appealing for somebody to try, right? So it can be a real challenge. There's different ways to solve it, which we can get into, but it certainly is, for anyone listening to this and thinking I'm excited, I'm going to go get some solutions and put them in place. Like, beware that the last step is hard.
Yeah, I'm curious about that last piece, Richard, around, this is a very discerning and busy group. And when they try something out, especially in the Gen AI era, where maybe it's not always consistent or it's not always correct, it's pretty easy to write solutions off. And I'm curious, like, how you work with people to sort of overcome this and keep trying, keep moving forward, keep pushing to, leverage the tools better.
Yeah, I mean, what you just described, Eric, happens especially in maybe it happens slightly less likely to often today, but still happens. So it was a huge problem for even the first half of this year, all of last year. You'd roll out some Gen AI solution, someone would try it, they'd say, well, this wasn't perfect, forget it, I'm done, I'm never using this thing again, this thing stinks, and go back. I'm going to go back to my old way of doing things, right? And there could be because there's a hallucination. It could be because there's a factual inaccuracy. It could be just the way it phrases something is not the way you like it, right? There's lots of things. I think in general, the challenge with Gen AI is that up until 2 years ago, every piece of software we've ever interacted with gives us a definitive answer, right? You ask the software question and it gives you the answer. The answer might be, I don't know, I don't have that data, right? But it's going to give you an answer, right? And that answer is going to be, as correct as the underlying data beneath that software is, right? And now suddenly it's not the case, right? You can get a 70% answer from a software, or 60% answer, an 80% answer, right? And can you even figure out that it's a 60 or 70 or 80% answer? It depends, right? Is it new skill for you to have to deal with? So training people on how to use that is hard. I think people are beginning to get used to it, but it's hard. You get a lot of that kind of resistance. And so that's partly why doing sort of in-depth training matters, because I think if you train people enough and get people thinking in a different mindset of how this technology is going to work, you can overcome that objection and then move on to other objections like, it took whatever that it's still not good enough that I want to use it, or it doesn't connect to this data source, so I don't want to use it, or whatever. But the it's not 100% right thing. It's like a lot of training and back and forth. I think the other thing I see as effective, especially with more senior folks, is really sitting down with someone one-on-one and having them use the tool. Right, you get half an hour with a partner at a fund, and you say, okay, you're going to use ChatGPT to summarize a sim. Right. And they may have never used it before. Even in this day and age, they may have never used it before or never uploaded a document to ChatGPT before. And then when they see it and they think, oh, wow, well, that was actually really good. And then you can show them, well, this is how you could do it differently to get exactly what you want. And suddenly they start to get it. And before this is how you do a deep research. Right. And before you know it, they're using it a lot, but they really need to have that hands-on experience in order to break through the gap.
Andy, I'm curious, in your seat at CVC, obviously you are heavily invested in change management and rolling out new tools periodically. What types of things work, when you think about training, implementation, configuration, just sort of writ large, what types of things have worked for you?
That's a great question. Obviously, lots of things have worked for us. Finding the common factor isn't always easy, but again, the theme of this topic is the alignment with the business. So if something aligns really well with the business, it comes naturally, and it's easy to adopt, doesn't require too much in the way of training. That factor that Richard mentioned there, right? The time out of your BAU demands is minimal. Then people can change very quickly. People can adapt things very quickly if it's intuitive to them. The bigger kind of changes, mindset changes, are need more central support, I would say. So you need that top down support that says we're doing this for all the right reasons and you need to get on board. A lot of the bigger system implementations are along those lines, and we always look for top management support to drive them through, because we need people to be able to justify, I need to take the time out of my day to learn this system, and so on. But we've had a few systems that just map very naturally to one particular function, and people can adopt it virtually overnight. If only they were all like that.
Richard, what about you in your seat? Any high level sort of lessons learned about what works and what doesn't? I mean, you mentioned a few things like taking the time to sit down with individuals and training. Anything else come to mind?
Well, I think that, that there can, another thing that I think is very important is making it easier for people to navigate the landscape of tools, even if it's just custom GPTs that you build. I think, what we've done at Bain and what I've seen at a few funds is they've created, fairly simple SharePoints that just say, here's all the different, tools, et cetera. But the key is not to have be tool first, right? I think it's very tempting, especially when engineers create this little web page I'm describing, to have it be like, here's a tool, and then it's like a description, and here's another tool, and here's a description, right? And that's how engineers think about tools, but it's not how like users think about tools, right? And so what we've tried to do very painstakingly is say, let's talk about use cases, right? Like, what are you trying to do? Where are you in, and starts with where are you in the deal process, right? Are you sourcing? Are you diligence? Are you, post close? Are you exit? And then for each of those, what are the specific use cases, right? So, and it's a fairly curated list that's not that long. And again, it's very use case driven. So I have a sim and I want to summarize it, right? I have a management meeting coming up and I want to prepare. I have a diligence questionnaire I need to fill out, right? That kind of thing. That's like very use case oriented. And then underneath it, it might say the name of the tool, but it's oriented around like how you think about the world. And we found that's pretty helpful, because then, people like that sort of thing, right? They can navigate it more easily. They can find the stuff they want. They can bookmark it if they want. And so that I think we've seen as a pretty good tip as well for this. And again, it's not like we're the only ones doing it. Some funds are, but I think most funds are still trying to figure out the right way to do that. So if you want to steal that idea, feel free.
Yeah.
I'd love to talk a little bit about tool selection. We in passing in the course of the conversation, we mentioned different criteria that might be important, such as APIs and interconnectivity. In my conversations with technology leaders across private markets, I hear about things just like user access and user management that can be a real burden, even if it seems quite trivial. Andy, I'm curious, maybe start with you. What are some of the things that you look for when you're evaluating tools, and maybe even to put a fine point on it, the tool selection, where does that start from in your experience? Does that usually bubble up from the business needs and particular groups within the firm? Is that usually more coming from the Office of Technology these days to be a bit more prescriptive about things that you want to buy versus build? What does that look like?
Yeah, I would say still the majority of the time it's coming up through the business, right? And what we ideally like to capture is that moment when you see the requirement rather than the system. And that all comes down to engagement with the business and making sure that the technology team is a good partner to the business, and we're having those conversations over the sort of challenges that they're seeing. And then I think it works really well when between the two of you realize there is a requirement there, there's a challenge to be dealt with, where technology can come through, and then that's designed and approached in that way. Sometimes it will come through as I want this system, and that can, you know, sometimes if it's a tool, a kind of standalone tool, maybe that's not too much to worry about. But you know, we often have to think about the broader environment, overlapping systems that, you know, in our existing landscape, possibly in, you know, different areas of the business, bringing those together. And yeah, but then as we go into system selection, we try to be as systematic as we can be, try to avoid any built-in bias. So putting together strict selection requirements. We have non-functional requirements which are based on our architectural principles that we layer in. And for sure, you know, things like IDAM integration, for example, is top of the list. Again, when you get to the more niche point solutions, they're not always so mature on that front. But we have our minimum sets around SSO and obviously information security requirements as well. But yeah, I find the best process is when we work together with the business on a business challenge where technology can be a part of the solution, and we evolve that solution and design it together, and really try to make sure that it fits into the current landscape, and that we think about all the implications across data and take up.
You know, Andy, the one thing I would add to that as a point, I think those are a great points about how you think about this. And so the one thing I would add is where I've seen a lot of funds get tripped up, I would say, is that especially when you're looking at a tool that touches your internal data, some of those getting to some of those decisions can take a really long time at a lot of funds that maybe either don't have a lot of IT capacity to evaluate things or other issues. And so, you know, that InfoSec piece, for example, could take 2 months before they decide that a vendor is okay to test. And, you know, and multiply that by the various other requirements you mentioned. And you could have a situation where it takes 3 months or 4 months before you're even able to test the vendor the first time. And then you decide it's not good, right? And you've just like wasted a lot of time, right? And so one of the things I would recommend to funds that are listening that want to get serious about adopting new tools in the future is to set up some sandboxes that make it easier to do some of the testing, right? So if you set up a sandbox that has, you know, box one just has public documents, right? So we can deploy any tool in that environment and there's no risk. It's you know, public documents. So then we don't have to worry about any of that stuff. We can just throw it in there and see, does it work? Right? Does it do the basic stuff? Right? And some amount of tools will fail at that point. They won't be able to do whatever it is you need them to do on the documents. They won't summarize them accurately, or they won't pull the right insights or whatever. Right? And then you can just say, great, we're done. This isn't going to work. Come back when you've improved, and we're done. And we did that in a week, and it didn't take months. And then you can have like another one where like, okay, if they pass that sandbox, then you do some amount of InfoSec, and then maybe they get into an area where there's a few documents that are internal documents, but they're old, right? And so therefore, like the risk is low, you know, they're 10 years old, so the risk is very low, right? And then, and so you can imagine a staged process by which you're not really going through that multi-month in journey until you're already pretty confident the tool is good. Yeah. And I think that's another piece that's just, you know, a lot of funds aren't yet thinking about, but just as more of these tools exist and you go through this process more times, making the decision up front to build that sandbox environment could save a lot of time in the long run.
No, that's a great point, Richard. And you may be looking at several systems, so you don't want to go through the heavy due diligence on every single one. So yeah, and we've done something very similar here at CBC. So.
How important is vendor consolidation in either of your minds? You know, when you think about due diligence and not wanting to repeat due diligence with some of the complexity of, you know, security analysis or even, you know, some of the more trivial things like invoicing, user management, access controls, you know, single APIs into multiple subsystems, these types of things. Is vendor consolidation significant in either of your minds?
I mean, I'll take that one for now. But yeah, absolutely. For me, it's so critical because it's easy. Again, when the business is driving selection, you will end up with a proliferation of vendors, proliferation of systems. I think more than anything, it's a manageability point of view, right? In terms of data and functionality and integration, before you get to vendor management and governance and DD type questions. The fewer solutions, the better. From my perspective, but again, we're driven by that nuanced, complex framework, and that we all live in, and so yeah, it's a constant battle. But I think, if we had the choice between two similar systems, one was with an existing vendor, we would probably, that would carry considerable weight.
Yeah, I think it's a really important thing, as Andy was saying. I mean, I think a place, just to be a specific use case where I think this kind of thing matters a lot, is like data rooms, right? So, data rooms have the most sensitive data, right? They have the most restrictions on how it gets used and shared. But I don't know of any fund I've talked to that doesn't want to be able to just like put their data room into an LLM and have the model analyze it and slice it and dice it and do that for you, because it's such a painful job and there's so many files. So that's a very common question. So, when you start to see the data room companies making acquisitions or big partnerships and things like that, it gives a lot of funds hope, I think, that rather than having to come up with some complicated solution on their own, there's just going to be a day where they can just like open up their data room, and then inside there will be, a button that just says like, do I want to turn on the LLM based solution? And then I'll say yes and pay some money, and then it'll work, and I won't have to have done any of the painful stuff that Andy was talking about. I'll just have it and it'll work, right? So that can happen through partnerships, but it can also happen through acquisition. And I think there's a lot of, I think a lot of people are looking forward to that and want to see more of that kind of thing happen, and because that makes it easy for them.
Yeah, I see that as one of the threads of our AI effort. We have this kind of grassroots, spread out the use of Gen AI tools and training and so on to everybody across the firm. Then we have more centralized initiatives to introduce, the higher value, more complex use cases, but also looking to vendors. Always looking to vendors. As a CTO of a manager, the vendors should be more of a partner than they are, I would say, in listening to us as a business, listening to our requirements and delivering on what we need. I've had a lot of conversations with vendors where they show us their Gen AI strategies, and it doesn't really move the needle for us. And so I think a lot of innovation can come that way, and it's a great leverage for us. We just don't have the teams to be able to innovate in every single aspect of our business. So that kind of consolidation and is an important part of our strategy going forward.
Well, I think that's a great place to stop. I'd like to thank everybody for joining today. And in particular, I'd like to thank our panelists for taking time out of their busy schedules and for this great discussion.